The story of the opioid epidemic in the United States began quietly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it was just another legal drug on pharmacy shelves, a promise of immediate pain relief. Doctors trusted what appeared to be a miracle solution for millions of Americans facing debilitating conditions. The promise of a cure seemed clear, and prescriptions multiplied in every corner of the country. What no one expected was that this same solution would become the nightmare of a generation. Now click like and subscribe to the channel. It will only take a second. Opioids, like many medicines, entered the homes of ordinary people, fathers, honest workers, and even athletes seeking recovery. What started as a promise of relief soon turned into a cycle of addiction. Families who once blindly trusted their doctor's prescriptions began to see side effects spread in devastating ways. In a matter of months, what was just a pill became the anchor of a national crisis. A crisis that, without warning, would take millions of lives. The difference between this crisis and other epidemics is precisely its origin. A drug that was supposed to cure, but which gradually turned out to be a trap. A dependency that does not discriminate, reaching all social classes. It was a problem that made no distinction between rich and poor, between urban and rural. The ensuing chaos was a collision between public health and private interests, leaving a trail of destruction. From this point on, the USA would no longer be the same. What many didn't know is that while prescriptions grew and profits increased, the problem was much deeper than simple chemical dependency. The roots of the crisis were being fed by something much bigger, an industry that seemed untouchable, and decisions that would prove fatal. And so, from a promise of relief came a shadow that would darken the lives of millions. But how did this transformation happen? And who were the ones truly responsible for letting this happen? Opioids are not a recent invention. For centuries, human beings have been looking for ways to alleviate pain. And that is how substances derived from opium gained prominence in medicine. At first, opioids were seen as a miracle cure for those suffering from severe pain, such as that resulting from surgery, cancer, or chronic illnesses. They were widely prescribed by doctors who believed they were offering safe and effective relief. But what seemed like an ideal solution soon revealed its darker side, the potential for addiction. It all started simply. The doctor prescribed it, the patient took it. But what no one saw, hidden behind these pills, was the slowly accumulating risk. The initial promise of healing turned into addiction. Patients began to notice that without medication, the pain returned with greater intensity. What was supposed to be a temporary treatment became a constant necessity. The relief did not last, and more doses were needed to achieve the same effect. Then, without realizing it, the addiction was starting to take hold. Many of these patients had never tried any type of controlled substance before. They trusted their doctors and believed the pills they were taking were safe. But, over time, physical and psychological dependence became a reality. What was once relief became prison. They now lived in a cycle of pain and need, trapped by a drug that dominated their lives. This transition from healing to addiction was not just a personal tragedy for many, but a problem that spread like an epidemic. What most people didn't know is that this dependence wasn't just a result of prolonged use. The pharmaceutical industry played a crucial role in this story. With promises that opioids were safe for long-term use, millions of prescriptions were written, and an entire country began to succumb to addiction. But how could something so devastating be allowed? How could a drug that was supposed to cure end up taking control of so many people's lives? Behind the rise of opioids was a powerful and nearly untouchable force: the pharmaceutical industry. What should be a sector focused on public health, focusing on the well-being of patients, turned out to be guided by financial interests. Large corporations, such as Purdue Pharma, saw opioids as a golden opportunity. What started with the promise of relieving pain quickly turned into an aggressive marketing strategy. And along the way, medical ethics was left behind. Pharmaceutical companies have gone to great lengths to promote opioids as the definitive solution to pain. With massive campaigns and generous benefits for doctors and hospitals, they have managed to insert opioids into the heart of the American healthcare system. Advertisements showed happy patients, free from pain, while the risks of addiction were minimized. The objective was clear: increase sales at any cost. And so, as profits rose, the addiction crisis began to spread. The most alarming thing is that, even in the face of warning signs, pharmaceutical companies continued to push their drugs. Doctors were encouraged to prescribe ever-increasing doses, and reports indicating the risks were conveniently ignored. Profit spoke louder. Each pill sold represented another victory for these corporations, while the lives of ordinary people were being destroyed. This dangerous game was not just about business, but about manipulating an entire system for financial gain. The responsibility of these companies is immeasurable. They created demand, fueled dependency, and yet continued to profit while millions suffered. But how did they manage to manipulate the system in such a profound way? And what was the role of doctors and the government in this process? The consequences of pharmaceutical companies' greed were just beginning to emerge, and the impact would be devastating for everyone involved. Purdue Pharma was the eye of the hurricane that turned the opioid crisis into a national catastrophe. When they launched OxyContin in 1996, this drug was touted as a revolutionary advance in pain management. The promise was tempting: a powerful, long-lasting painkiller that provided continuous relief without the risk of addiction. Doctors across the country began prescribing the drug, believing they were offering a safe solution for their patients. What they didn't know was that they were being fooled by one of the most aggressive and deceptive marketing campaigns in history. Purdue Pharma knew the dangers of OxyContin. Internal reports indicated that the drug was highly addictive, but this was not enough to stop the race for profit. Instead, the company developed a carefully orchestrated strategy to minimize risk and maximize sales. Purdue representatives visited doctors' offices across the country, encouraging doctors to prescribe ever-increasing doses. All this while, studies indicating the dangers of addiction were ignored or conveniently distorted. OxyContin quickly became one of the best-selling drugs in the United States, and Purdue Pharma racked up billions of dollars in profits. However, as sales soared, so did reports of addiction. Patients who used the drug to treat moderate pain began to develop severe addictions. Many, upon realizing that they could no longer live without the medicine, ended up switching to illicit drugs, such as heroin, in search of cheaper and more accessible relief. The result was a mass tragedy that spread across the country. The story of Purdue Pharma and OxyContin is one of the darkest in the trajectory of modern medicine. The company not only fueled a crisis, but thrived on it, at the cost of millions of lives. The collapse that followed left an indelible mark on American society, and the impact is still felt today. But how did a company manage to cheat an entire system and continue making profits for so long? And why couldn't anyone stop them in time? At the center of this silent epidemic were doctors, professionals who have always been seen as guardians of health. They trusted that the information provided by pharmaceutical companies was accurate and safe. Opioids were recommended as effective treatments for chronic pain with a low risk of addiction. But what the doctors didn't know was that they were being used as pawns in a much bigger game. And so they began prescribing opioids in alarming quantities, without fully understanding the monster they were helping to feed. In offices and hospitals across the country, doctors saw patients who needed immediate relief from their pain. And, as pharmaceutical companies ensured the safety of opioids, prescriptions increased. It was almost a magic solution. a pill that took away the pain and allowed patients to get back to their lives. However, what many doctors didn't realize was that they were helping to create a generation of addicts. Every prescription written was a step towards addiction, and by the time the first signs appeared, it was too late for many. Over time, doctors themselves began to realize that something was seriously wrong. Patients came back again and again, asking for stronger doses or, worse yet, continued prescriptions. What initially seemed like a safe solution turned into a web of dependency. Doctors, once champions of healing, were faced with the painful reality that they were contributing to an unprecedented crisis. The trust that existed between doctors and patients was shaken, and many professionals were lost, not knowing how to repair the damage. The relationship of trust between doctors and the pharmaceutical industry would never be the same. What once seemed like a partnership for the good of public health turned out to be a death trap. Doctors were in the eye of a storm they could not control, and doubt about safe treatments began to spread. But how did these professionals, trained to save lives, end up becoming key players in a crisis of such magnitude? And how could this trust, now broken, be restored? In the beginning, patients were simply people seeking relief from their pain. They were not drug addicts, much less looking for addictions. They were parents, children, workers who suffered from painful and chronic conditions. The promise of opioids seemed like the perfect solution to these ills. And, trusting their doctors, they followed the prescriptions to the letter. But what was supposed to be temporary soon became permanent. Without realizing it, these people were trapped in a cycle of addiction that slowly consumed them. For many patients, the relief the pills offered was almost magical. The pain that previously paralyzed their days dissipated with a simple dose, allowing them to return to work or their normal activities. However, over time, addiction began to creep in silently. The doses that were previously sufficient stopped having an effect, and then a new reality began to emerge. Without opioids, the pain returned with overwhelming force. For many, the solution was to increase doses, desperately seeking lost relief. What these patients didn't know was that they were entering a path of no return. The dependence was not only physical, but also psychological. The idea of living without the medication became terrifying. Many began to turn to different doctors to obtain more prescriptions, while others, desperate, turned to the illegal market. What began as a solution to physical pain quickly became a spiral of destruction. And so, ordinary people who had never touched illicit drugs found themselves trapped in a devastating addiction. These patients were not criminals, but they were turned into addicts without even realizing it. The trust they placed in the medical and pharmaceutical systems was cruelly betrayed. And for many, a return to normality seemed impossible. But how did these people, who initially only sought relief, reach this point of despair? And what could be done to rescue them from this abyss of dependence that consumed them? Opioid dependence is something that goes beyond common addiction. It infiltrates silently, turning into a physical and emotional need. What many did not know when starting their treatments is that these drugs activate the brain's pleasure centers, creating a feeling of euphoria that, for those who live with pain, seems like the answer to all their problems. However, the body quickly gets used to this sensation, and soon the same dose is no longer enough. Thus, the cycle begins. The more you take, the more you need. The pain that opioids were supposed to cure begins to become a constant ghost. Patients report that, when they stop taking the medication, the pain returns with much greater intensity. It is not just the original pain that reappears, but a new type of suffering, that of withdrawal. The body, now dependent on opioids, reacts violently to the lack of the drug, and the withdrawal symptoms, nausea, vomiting, insomnia, and extreme anxiety, are so strong that they seem unbearable. Physical dependence becomes an impossible burden to bear. But it's not just the body that clings to opioids. The mind also surrenders to this substance, associating the pill with emotional relief. Many patients, when taking opioids, feel not only the physical pain disappear, but also the anxieties of everyday life dissipate. This creates an even stronger bond with the drug. It becomes the solution to problems that go far beyond pain. And as dependence grows, the world around you begins to fall apart. Relationships, jobs, dreams, everything takes a back seat to the need to get your next fix. This dependence takes over lives in a way that few can predict. What started as a medical tool turns into an invisible prison. And for those stuck in this cycle, getting out seems like an impossible task. But how do you get rid of something that is so deeply rooted in your body and mind? And how did millions of people in the United States get led into this trap without realizing they were walking into an abyss? The American government, which should be the guardian of public health, failed at a critical moment. When the first signs that opioids were being abused began to emerge, public health officials did not act quickly enough. The FDA, responsible for approving and regulating medications, has not implemented strict enough controls to prevent the rampant prescribing of opioids. The rules that were supposed to protect citizens were full of loopholes, allowing pharmaceutical companies and doctors to continue distributing opioids in an almost unrestricted manner. The fact is that for years, the government hesitated to intervene effectively. Regulatory agencies, pressured by the political and economic influence of large pharmaceutical companies, were slow to realize the severity of the crisis. As industry profits grew, overdose deaths quietly rose. This cycle of inaction cost thousands of Americans their lives, and even when measures began to be taken, they were often reactive, trying to put out the fire after it had already devastated countless lives. However, this failure was not just limited to a lack of regulation. The healthcare system, with its complex and bureaucratic structure, allowed doctors to continue prescribing opioids in excessive quantities without any adequate supervision. In many cases, states themselves did not have sufficient resources to monitor prescription abuse. The lack of effective rehabilitation programs for addicts and the absence of educational campaigns about the risks of opioids have left the population at the mercy of a growing crisis. This combination of negligence and delay in acting has allowed the opioid epidemic to expand to frightening proportions. Thousands of lives were destroyed as the government slowly and ineffectively tried to control the situation. But how could the country have allowed something so devastating to happen before its eyes? And what measures could have been adopted to prevent the situation from reaching this critical point? When opioid prescriptions began to decline due to new regulations, many addicts found themselves at a crossroads. Addiction, already deeply rooted, does not simply disappear when legal remedies become inaccessible. Without viable alternatives to deal with pain and withdrawal, many of these patients turn to the illegal drug market. And that's where heroin and fentanyl come into play, offering relief that's as powerful as it is lethal. The affordable price and availability on the streets turn these narcotics into fatal substitutes. Heroin, once seen as a fringe drug, has regained popularity among those who can no longer fill their legal opioid prescriptions. But it was fentanyl, a synthetic opioid up to 50 times more potent than heroin, that brought devastating consequences. Trafficked clandestinely, fentanyl began to be mixed with other drugs, such as heroin and cocaine, often without users' knowledge. The result has been an alarming increase in fatal overdoses. In a matter of months, fentanyl became the leading cause of opioid deaths in the U.S. The illegal drug market thrived on this growing demand. Cartels and criminal organizations saw a golden opportunity to profit from the opioid crisis, fueling the addiction of millions of Americans. Entire cities, especially in rural areas, have been devastated by the presence of these drugs. Small communities that once only dealt with the side effects of prescription opioid addiction now faced an even more dangerous drug epidemic with deadly consequences. The rise of heroin and fentanyl on the illegal market has only intensified the crisis. What began as a medical problem has turned into a public health crisis, reaching every corner of the country. And now, combating synthetic opioid trafficking has become one of the biggest challenges for American authorities. But how did this transition from prescription drug addiction to the illegal market happen so quickly? And how can we stop the growing influence of these deadly drugs in the daily lives of communities? The opioid epidemic was not just limited to individuals who used the drugs. It spread like a silent poison through American communities, affecting entire families. Small towns and rural areas in particular have been deeply affected. The addiction of a family member, be it a father, mother, or even a child, becomes an unbearable burden for everyone around. Families, once structured and full of dreams, saw their homes slowly dismantle under the weight of dependence. For many of these families, the emotional impact has been devastating. Seeing someone you love sink into addiction day after day is an indescribable pain. The constant fear of an imminent overdose, the lies, the disappearances, the failed attempts at rehabilitation. Children grew up watching their parents be consumed by addiction, while desperate parents tried to save their children from addiction. What were once strong family ties have fallen apart, creating a generation marked by loss and trauma. This crisis was not limited to the personal sphere. Local communities were deeply shaken. With the increase in dependencies, social problems also came: crimes, suicides, and an overload on health services. Hospitals and rehabilitation centers, already strapped for resources, struggled to care for the growing number of addicts. Small businesses closed their doors, and local economies collapsed. The social fabric, which held these communities together, was torn apart. What was once an individual problem has become a collective issue. Families, now devastated, are searching for answers. How did they get to that point? How can we reverse the impact of a crisis that destroyed lives, dreams, and entire communities? And, most importantly, how can we rescue those still trapped in this web of dependency and pain before it is too late? These questions remain without clear answers, while the cycle of destruction seems to have no end. The relationship between opioids and mental health is a dangerous and often underestimated spiral. For those already living with problems such as depression or anxiety, the use of opioids appears to offer relief not only from physical pain, but also from emotional suffering. However, what many do not realize is that these medications worsen mental conditions in the long term. By creating a feeling of temporary euphoria, opioids mask symptoms, but leave a trail of emotional instability when their effects wear off. For patients struggling with pain and mental health disorders, the relief that opioids offer can seem like a blessing. But this relationship is misleading. As dependence increases, symptoms of depression and anxiety intensify, creating a vicious cycle. The more the person uses the drug to alleviate suffering, the more the suffering grows. Studies show that people with mental illnesses are more likely to develop opioid addictions. And once trapped in this addiction, their psychological conditions deteriorate quickly. The effects on mental health are not limited to just patients. The families of these people are also affected. Living with someone struggling with opioid addiction is emotionally exhausting. Emotional exhaustion, frustration, and helplessness in the face of a loved one's suffering can trigger mental health problems in family members. They find themselves involved in a constant battle to save someone who is sinking, without knowing how to deal with the situation. This connection between opioids and mental health creates an even greater challenge for recovery. It is not enough to treat physical dependence. It is necessary to deal with the emotional trauma that accompanies it. But how to offer a treatment that integrates body and mind effectively? And, most importantly, How can we ensure that those struggling with addiction find the psychological support they need to rebuild their lives? As the opioid epidemic spread across the United States, a terrifying new phenomenon began to emerge: overdose deaths. At first, these cases seemed isolated, individual tragedies amid a larger crisis. But quickly, the statistics began to reveal a frightening picture. Overdose deaths have multiplied on an alarming scale, reaching numbers that have shocked even public health experts. Within a few years, opioids became the leading cause of overdose deaths in the country, surpassing other drugs and even automobile accidents. Fentanyl, in particular, played a central role in this explosion of fatalities. Its lethal power is devastating. Small amounts, often invisible to the naked eye, are enough to cause an overdose. And when mixed with other drugs, such as heroin or even illegally sold medications, fentanyl becomes a deadly trap for unsuspecting users. It was no longer about long-term addicts, but people who, in a single use, lost their lives without even understanding the danger they were in. The stories of these deaths are devastating. Families who lost loved ones unexpectedly, often without realizing how deep the addiction had taken root. Young people with promising futures, fathers and workers were found dead, victims of an overdose that no one predicted. These tragedies have turned the opioid epidemic into an unprecedented public health crisis, generating grief and pain in every corner of the country. With each new death, despair grew. The scenario of despair was palpable. Communities began to be defined by the lives lost, as the government struggled to find an effective response. The impact of these deaths reverberates to this day, leaving families and entire communities in ruins. But how did we get to this point? And what can be done to stop this escalation of deaths and save future generations from an even greater tragedy? After years of inaction, the pharmaceutical industry, especially Purdue Pharma, finally faced the consequences of its actions. The burden of responsibility has reached the courts, and Big Pharma has been thrust into the spotlight. A wave of multi-billion-dollar lawsuits have been filed against pharmaceutical companies, accusing them of fueling the opioid epidemic by hiding the real risks and misleading doctors and patients. What was once an untouchable empire, built on gigantic profits, was now being judged for its part in the devastation of millions of lives. Purdue Pharma, the creator of OxyContin, was among the first to face legal consequences. The company was accused of aggressively marketing the drug while hiding the dangers of addiction. The sales tactics, which included rewarding doctors for prescribing more opioids, became a key part of the investigations. In billion-dollar settlements, Purdue partially admitted its guilt, but the compensation, although immense, will never be able to fully repair the damage caused. These processes are not only aimed at financial punishment, but also at changing the practices of pharmaceutical industries. Some of the money raised in the settlements went toward rehabilitation programs, education on safe medication use, and prevention of opioid abuse. However, true victory lies in exposing the truth. Pharmaceutical companies can no longer claim ignorance. The wheels of this flawed system were revealed, and the legal consequences were a milestone in the fight against this crisis. Despite this, the question that remains is, has justice been fully served? Although companies have been fined billions, many of the affected families will never be able to recover what they lost. And although changes are underway, the legacy left by Big Pharma will continue to haunt the U.S. healthcare system for years to come. Are these legal processes enough to prevent something like this from happening again? Or are we just seeing the tip of a much bigger iceberg? As the opioid crisis has reached alarming proportions, the need for rehabilitation and treatment has become urgent. However, the battle to overcome addiction is an arduous journey full of obstacles. Many addicts try and fail countless times. Treatment for opioid addiction goes far beyond simple detox. involves a holistic approach that takes care of both physical dependence and the emotional and psychological damage caused by the drug. But the question many ask is there really a way out? Rehabilitation clinics, spread across the country, try to offer hope to those who find themselves at rock bottom. Initial detox is just the first step, and many who go through this process face the constant fear of relapse. Treatment involves intensive therapies, psychological support, and, in many cases, the use of medications such as methadone or buprenorphine, which help control withdrawal symptoms. But, for many, leaving addiction is a battle that requires strength and determination, something that is not always easy to find when you are in the middle of chaos. Family and community support is crucial in this process. Rehabilitation does not occur in a vacuum. Patients need support networks that help them resist temptations and overcome daily challenges. Families that were once destroyed by addiction have the chance to restructure, but the path is not simple. It takes patience, understanding, and, above all, hope. Many patients report that the only thing that prevents them from falling back into addiction is the unconditional support of those who love them. Still, the success rate is low, and relapse is a constant reality. The lack of adequate resources to treat everyone in need is another major challenge. Even with all efforts, the opioid epidemic continues to grow. Are current rehabilitation methods sufficient? Or is something deeper needed to face this crisis effectively and lastingly? The opioid crisis has also found fertile ground within the American prison system. Thousands of people dependent on opioids end up being arrested, often for crimes committed to support their addiction. Petty theft, robbery, and even participation in drug trafficking are common among addicts who seek any way to obtain money to meet their needs. But what happens when these people, trapped in a cycle of addiction, enter prisons? There, the addiction does not disappear, and in many cases, it intensifies. Inside prisons, access to opioids, although illegal, remains present. Drugs are smuggled into cells, and addicts continue to use them. The lack of adequate treatment in prisons means that many prisoners simply perpetuate their addiction, without ever having a real chance of rehabilitation. The prison system, which should serve as a space for rehabilitation and social reintegration, turns into an even deeper prison for addicts, who now fight against two enemies: physical prison and chemical dependency. The challenge is that American prisons are not equipped to deal with the complexity of opioid addiction. Although some treatment initiatives are beginning to emerge in certain states, most prisoners do not receive the support they need to detox safely. The lack of effective treatment programs within prisons is one of the factors contributing to the high rate of criminal recidivism. Without treatment, many leave prison and immediately return to the world of drugs, perpetuating the cycle of crime and addiction. This scenario raises a crucial question: how to deal with the opioid epidemic within the prison system? Is incarcerating addicts the most effective solution, or are we just making the problem worse? The answer to this question continues to be debated, but the fact is that without adequate treatment within prisons, addiction not only survives, but thrives, waiting for the moment to break free when these individuals return to society. The media played a dual role in the opioid crisis. On the one hand, it helped expose the gravity of the situation, but on the other, it contributed to sensationalism that often distorted the facts. When the epidemic began to gain prominence in mainstream media outlets, stories about addicts and overdoses quickly became headlines. However, instead of focusing on the root causes of the problem, the media often chose to explore the more shocking and tragic side of the crisis, turning human suffering into spectacle. Television programs and news reports often presented the opioid crisis in a simplistic manner, portraying addicts as villains or victims without depth. Not only did this further stigmatize those who were struggling with addiction, but it also perpetuated a lack of understanding about the complexity of addiction. Instead of discussing effective solutions or exploring the flaws of the healthcare system and the pharmaceutical industry, the focus was on shocking images of overdoses and individual tragedies, creating a narrative that generated fear but little enlightenment. On the other hand, the media also played an important role in exposing the failures of big pharmaceutical companies and the government. Documentaries and journalistic investigations have revealed the dark behind the scenes of opioid promotion, showing how greed and manipulation contributed to the epidemic. These revelations put pressure on the government and pharmaceutical companies to respond more forcefully. Media coverage, while often sensationalistic, has also helped put the opioid crisis at the center of the national debate. Still, the question remains: how to balance the need to expose the truth without resorting to sensationalism. The opioid crisis is a complex problem that requires responsible and in-depth coverage. But are the media prepared to abandon sensationalism and provide the public with a real understanding of the crisis? Or will we continue to see headlines that focus more on the shock than the solution? Although many measures have been taken to try to curb the opioid crisis, the future still seems uncertain. The nature of this epidemic is such that despite the actions of the government, justice, and civil society, the problem continues to evolve. New synthetic drugs, such as fentanyl, pose an even greater challenge than the original opioids. These substances are more potent, more deadly, and more difficult to control. Thus, the opioid crisis appears to be far from resolved and may, in fact, turn into something even darker. Experts predict that as long as there is demand, and as long as addiction is deeply rooted in millions of people, the black market will continue to thrive. The pressure on authorities to deal with synthetic opioid trafficking is immense, but so far, efforts appear to be one step behind the new substances emerging. The fight against this epidemic is a race against time, and each new overdose shows that, for many, time is running out. Another worrying aspect is the possible evolution of the crisis into other forms of dependence. As prescription opioid use becomes more controlled, there is fear that other substances will take their place. This has been seen before, when access to heroin and fentanyl replaced OxyContin prescriptions. The cycle of addiction and the search for new ways to alleviate pain or emotional suffering seem endless, creating a crisis that adapts and reinvents itself, even in the face of efforts to contain it. Looking to the future, the question that remains is, how can we break this cycle? Are current measures, however robust, sufficient to combat a crisis that continues to transform? What more needs to be done to prevent new generations from falling into the same trap that has already destroyed so many lives? These questions still remain unanswered, leaving the future of the opioid crisis shrouded in uncertainty and concern. The impact of opioids is not just a matter of numbers or statistics. It is reflected in the real lives of people and families, spanning entire generations. The human toll of this epidemic is immeasurable. In communities across the country, children are growing up without parents. Grandparents are taking on the role of caregivers, and entire families are torn apart by loss, addiction, and grief. What was a medical crisis has become a social crisis, and its effects reverberate in the lives of those left behind. Children, in particular, suffer the most profound consequences. Children of opioid addicts often grow up in unstable homes, dealing with neglect, trauma, and, in many cases, the loss of their own parents to addiction or overdose. These children, deprived of a safe and peaceful childhood, end up inheriting a legacy of trauma, and, in some cases, their own vulnerability to addiction. The epidemic has created a generation marked by suffering, and the emotional scars of these children may take years, if not decades, to heal. The damage caused by the epidemic extends beyond families. Communities that were once tight-knit, with schools and small businesses flourishing, have been destroyed by the ravages of addiction. Small towns have been transformed into places where mourning is constant, and progress seems like a distant dream. The ripple effect of this crisis is not limited to one individual. It spreads, affecting everyone around, destroying dreams, families, and entire communities. Looking ahead, it is clear that social and emotional reconstruction will be one of the greatest challenges of the opioid crisis. How can we heal a generation marked by this tragedy? How can we help these children overcome loss and trauma? And, most importantly, how do we ensure that these emotional scars don't turn into a cycle of addiction that will continue to haunt future generations? These are the questions we need to answer if we are to build a better future for those who survived this devastation. With the devastating advancement of the opioid crisis, the implementation of effective prevention policies has become urgent. State and federal governments, along with healthcare organizations, have begun to devise new strategies to tackle the problem head-on. Among the main actions are changes to prescription regulations. Today, doctors are under greater control, and opioid prescriptions are much more closely monitored, limiting uncontrolled access to these drugs. However, these changes, while important, are just one piece of the puzzle in the fight against this epidemic. Awareness campaigns also gained strength. Schools, communities, and even large companies are coming together to educate people about the risks of opioids. These campaigns seek to alert the public about the dangers of indiscriminate use of medication and the reality of addiction, which can affect anyone, regardless of social class. Awareness is one of the most powerful tools in prevention because the more informed people are, the greater the chance of avoiding the trap of addiction. Additionally, distribution programs for naloxone, a medication capable of reversing opioid overdoses, are being expanded in many communities. Naloxone, distributed free of charge in some states, has already saved countless lives, and its presence in community centers, schools, and even police stations is an essential measure to curb the number of overdose deaths. These initiatives are signs that finally, there is a proactive response to mitigate the effects of this crisis, although there is still a long way to go. Still, the big question remains: are these policies enough to contain such a deep-rooted epidemic? While changes to laws and education are vital steps, the truth is that the opioid problem is complex and multifaceted. Will these measures really be able to change the course of this crisis? Or are we just scratching the surface of an issue that requires even deeper and more comprehensive solutions? Pain clinics have unintentionally become one of the main epicenters of the opioid crisis in the United States. These clinics, created to treat patients with chronic and debilitating pain, began prescribing opioids as a quick and effective solution for pain relief. However, many of them lost control over the volume of prescriptions and soon turned into pill factories. With an overburdened healthcare system and doctors often pressed for time, these clinics saw opioids as an immediate answer to their patients' needs without considering the long-term consequences. In many cases, these clinics prescribed opioids without adequate monitoring, and the cycle of addiction began. Patients who trusted their doctors to ease their pain were introduced to a drug that would trap them in a vicious cycle of relief and constant need. Prescriptions, which should have been closely monitored, became an easy and affordable solution, and the increase in the number of prescriptions began to have devastating consequences for patients and their families. The problem was worsened by the lack of adequate regulation of these clinics. In many regions, doctors with little or no expertise in chronic pain could open pain clinics and begin prescribing opioids on a large scale. The lack of supervision allowed many professionals to take advantage of the situation, creating an environment conducive to abuse. So-called pill clinics have spread across the country, often without any control from health authorities, fueling the opioid addiction epidemic. These clinics have, ironically, become launching points for the destruction of lives when they should be places of healing. Although some steps have been taken to regulate these clinics and reduce the amount of opioids prescribed, the legacy left by this uncontrolled approach still persists. But how to reverse the damage caused? And can pain clinics return to fulfilling their original role safely and effectively? Amid the darkness of the opioid crisis, there are stories of hope and redemption that remind us that recovery is possible. Many individuals, after years of struggling with addiction, have managed to free themselves from the grip of opioids and rebuild their lives. These stories, although painful and full of challenges, show the resilience of human beings and the strength of the spirit in overcoming even the deepest addictions. For many, the support of their families and communities was key to this turnaround. Rehabilitation, although difficult, is a path to healing. Intensive treatment programs, which include psychological support and ongoing support, have given many addicts a second chance. Stories of people who lost everything, their homes, their jobs, their families, but who, with time and the right help, managed to get back on their feet, serve as inspiration for others who are still struggling. These people, who often started at a point of no hope, now share their experiences to help others find their path to sobriety. These stories of overcoming also remind us of the importance of emotional support. Friends and family play a key role in recovery. Many addicts report that it was the unconditional love and support of those by their side that helped them not to give up. The process is slow and relapses are a reality, but the path to recovery is a journey of small steps towards liberation. Every day, sober is a victory. These success stories, however, raise a question. What more can be done to expand opportunities for recovery for everyone? How can we ensure that more people have access to the right support and treatment to get back on their feet? And how can these overcoming experiences be a light for those who are still trapped in the darkness of addiction? Hope, after all, is one of the most powerful ingredients in the fight against addiction. The opioid crisis in the United States has revealed deep and disturbing truths about modern society. What began as a medical solution to pain turned into an epidemic that destroyed millions of lives, exposing the flaws in a system that was supposed to protect its citizens. At the center of it all was a dark secret: the confluence of corporate interests, lax regulations, and blind trust in easy solutions. The opioid crisis is not only a public health tragedy, but also a lesson in the devastating power of greed and negligence. Today, when we look at the past, we realize that many warning signs were ignored. Doctors, patients, families, and entire communities were caught by surprise. But the truth is that the seeds of this crisis were being planted decades ago. What we have learned from this epidemic is that trust in a system without accountability can be fatal. The lessons learned show us that, without vigilance and proactive action, crises like this can easily be repeated with other drugs or other industries. Looking forward, the question is, how can we prevent something like this from happening again? The lessons from the opioid crisis are painful but necessary. They remind us that protecting public health requires more than medicines and treatments. It requires ethics, responsibility, and, above all, empathy with those who are suffering. Each story of pain and overcoming is proof that, despite everything, there is hope. But have we learned enough from this crisis to truly change the future? Now, as we end this journey through the opioid crisis, one last thought remains. What legacy do we want to leave for the next generations? Will we be able to create a healthcare system that values life above profit? Or will we continue to walk in the shadow of dark secrets, waiting for the next crisis? The answer is in our hands.
Hey explorers, if you love discovering the amazing curiosities and stories we share here on Exploring Nations, how about supporting the channel with just $1? This small gesture can make a big difference and is essential to keep this content going. Without your support, our journey might be cut short. And there's more. When you shop on Amazon, use our special link. It costs you nothing extra, plus you get an exclusive discount and it helps us out a lot. The links for donations and Amazon are pinned in the first comment. Don't let this adventure stop, we're counting on you. Subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and drop us a comment.